Hi, this is TheHande, and welcome back to the Leaders of Finland podcast. And yes, today it is finally time for the Finnish Civil War video. And as you can see from the background, I have moved again, and I feel like I need to apologize that it's almost taken me another goddamn year to get another video out in the series. My intention was not to do it like this, doing it in another video podcast format like I did last year. But yeah, I wasn't able to get off my ass and get the Civil War video done as I had hoped I would. I decided, like, you know what, I finally want to get it out of my system, so let's finally do it. And also, yes, I'm recording this. It's still pretty hot in Finland, so sorry if I seem a bit sweaty in the video. But yeah, the thing is, like, so that's partly the reason also. Like, I just don't have the energy to sit down and do, like, a script or stuff like that. I have my notes for this video that I already did last year, that I've been sitting on for about a year and a half at this point. And I have been, like, prepping mentally to these videos. So in case you don't know, the way I do these, like, when I do these face cam videos, I don't have like a literal script, like not like a word for word script. I usually have some notes, but I do mentally then prep for how to present them. And I'm a little worried that I might, present stuff in the wrong order, or I might forget to include some stuff. So this is going to be, unfortunately, a bit of a rambly video podcast. The only structure that I have really thought about for this is that I'm going to try to go through the events leading up to the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, in chronological order. But I might jump around back and forth on this. So sorry if that bothers you, but that's really the only way I know how I'm going to be able to, pull this off. But to start a little bit generally, so the Finnish Civil War took place between the January and May of 1918. Finland, of course, became independent on the 6th of December, 1917. So the Civil War happened very soon after independence. I've mentioned it briefly in previous Leaders of Finland videos, and particularly, you might remember I made a whole video about Finland's old flag, which, by the way, you will... this is not the flag, but this is the insignia of the Finnish Defense Forces. But yeah, the Finnish flag before it became the now iconic Blue Cross flag. It was originally just the Finnish lion on a red background, because that is, that's the Finnish coat of arms as well. And it's like an historical heraldic symbol representing Finland. So the Finnish Civil War is by far one of Finland's most traumatic wars. As I would imagine any civil war is, because it is the people of the same nation fighting against each other. And especially in the case of the Finnish Civil War, it was such a meaningless, stupid conflict, which was fueled by nothing except political divisions. You could also maybe argue class divisions, but considering what we gained out of it, which is in the end, and what followed afterwards, it was a pretty horrible thing. So the Civil War was a very short conflict, but it then extended its shadow across the entirety of the 1920s and really well into the 1930s. There are some arguments about this, but generally it's kind of agreed upon that the damage that was done in the Civil War to Finnish psyche and Finnish unity didn't really become mended until the Second World War. Really until Finland had a common enemy to fight against, which was Soviet Union. But yes, so let's talk about this. So Finland's history, of course, I've mentioned this I've mentioned this recently in like the video where I was talking about the Swedish school stuff. I've really liked doing those school videos. I've had to take a little bit of a break because of my move and everything, but I do intend to make more videos in that series as well, if you've been enjoying those. But I mentioned this before, that Finland as a geopolitical entity, really first formalized under the Swedish throne. We were a province under the Swedish throne. And then during the Napoleonic Wars, we were annexed into Russia. But we were annexed in a very interesting way, which was the fact that we were an autonomous duchy. A duchy implies that there was a duke. There really wasn't. There was a governor general who was kind of the formal representative of the Tsar of the Russian Empire. But effectively, Finland had autonomy, which is to say we had our own national assembly. It was called the Finnish Senate, and it was the precursor to the Finnish government. I mentioned that in a lot of old Leaders of Finland videos. So basically, under the Tsar, and for the first 50-ish years under the Tsarist rule, Finland had a pretty good thing going. Well, actually more than 50 years, but so because Russia really only took Finland in order to have a buffer zone against Sweden, which at the time of the Napoleonic Wars was still like a major world player, and then but they didn't really want to use a lot of resources. I don't know if you know about this about Russia, but they're really good at conquering stuff. They're not very good at ruling stuff. And especially under the Tsar, the Tsars were not really interested in Finland. So they said, like, look, let the Finns sort themselves out. We can just send some troops over there to maintain peace and order. But other than that, we were kind of allowed to do our own thing. So the first couple of Tsars, let the Finland just do whatever it wanted. But then during the last couple Tsars of the Russian Empire, that's when things started to sour between Finland and Russia. The Tsars, for some reason, got this idea in their heads that Finns weren't Russian enough. So what we had was something called Russification, or the years of oppression. And this was during the time when Russians were basically trying to force Finns into becoming more Russian, using Russian more in everyday life, as opposed to Finnish and Swedish, which were our common languages. And basically the Finns weren't having any of it. And there's a video I've made about Finnish political assassinations, the most famous one ever, and I actually have his picture here. Wait, there we go. I went to. So Babrakov was the Finnish governor general who got assassinated during the first era of Russification, and it was kind of like the violent endpoint of the Finnish resistance. But it wasn't the thing that actually ended the Finnish Russification, the first Russification wave. It actually ended in 1905 with a general strike. And that's actually one of the first major events that we can consider to have a kind of a precursor to the Civil War. So, like I said, the Civil War was caused by class divisions between the political and also a political divide. So basically, the higher classes tended to be more right-leaning, and then the lower class a little bit more left-leaning. Socialism had started to really form as an ideology in the 1800s and was becoming, the popular movement in Finland. So in our national assembly, the Senate, the Social Democratic Party, which still exists today, was starting to become a rising power because a lot of working people liked the cut of their jib and then were voting them in large numbers. And the general strike of 1905 is the thing that ended Russification. Because it stopped all production of anything in Finland. And the Tsar realized, like, this isn't worth the effort. Let's just, let's just put a hold on Russification. They resumed it a few years later, obviously. But then World War I is what stopped it. And World War I is, of course, a big reason for why Finland became independent in the first place, because that directly contributed to Finland becoming independent. Another thing about Finnish autonomy was the fact that Finns were not too keen on serving in the Russian Imperial Army. Russia had tried multiple times to get Finnish men to join the army by force, and what that kind of led to was then that Finnish men were being like hidden in the countryside and things like that. But there were some Finns who did serve in the Russian Imperial military. I'm bringing this up because this is also important background. And one important person who served in the Finnish imperial military and who's going to be a major player in the story of the Finnish Civil War, our eventual fifth president here, Marshal Mannerheim, Carl Gustav Emil. So some Finns did join the Imperial Army, and Mannerheim in particular was a very decorated soldier who did a lot of interesting stuff and would be a major player there. But so back to the general strike. So the general strike ended Russification, which was seen broadly as a good thing. But the guys on the Finnish political right, the aristocracy and the highbrow members of society, were kind of freaked out by it, because it was organized by the labor unions who worked with the SDP. So, and they were really scared by the fact that these, unwashed peasants had this kind of say and power that they could stop the Civil War. By the way, this picture is from the general strike. So that already started to breed distrust between the left and right. And then as World War I finally rolled around, things got even worse. So another thing to remember, Finland was officially ruled by Russia, even though we ruled ourselves also a little bit. And at this point in time, between the 1800s and the 1900s, the idea of a police force or some kind of a national force that would maintain order was still a relatively new thing. Like, some countries started having their own police forces in the 1800s, but in a lot of places, Finland included, the military was responsible for maintaining civil order. So the Russian military was effectively not just Finland's military defense at the time. They were also like the law enforcement. So if somebody committed a crime and they needed to be convicted, they would send soldiers to arrest those guys. And the soldiers were the ones who held them until court and stuff like that. Well, as you know, then the World War I happened, and Russia took a beating in it in a way that they started running out of resources. Russia was, the war dragged out longer and longer. And eventually, Russia was, and that eventually in 1917 would lead to two revolutions: the February Revolution and the October Revolutions. It's important. People need to remember that the first revolution, that's the one that removed the Tsar, but the October Revolution was actually the Bolshevik Revolution. That's when the Soviet Union was formed, and all the way through that. These Russian soldiers were having to go off, leaving the country, and there was starting to be a vacuum of nobody is like really looking out for us. So what are we going to do? Well, at this point, Finns already started to form their own small form National Guards. And if you don't know what a National Guard is, now it depends from place to place. But in this context, a National Guard is an informal military unit. So it wasn't like officially affiliated with the government or anything. It was just Finnish citizens getting together and forming a military unit who basically did were supposed to do the same kind of stuff as, a police force would do. They would do night patrols, they would arrest people if they did crimes or things like that. But what happened with these National Guards very quickly was that they got heavily politicized. And they got heavily politicized across the right-left axis. And the divide, actually, the map here I have that's in the rotation is from a bit later, but it helps you illustrate something. The left took over heavily in southern parts of Finland, i.e. the industrialized parts of Finland, because obviously the red rhetoric was resonated very well with people working in like factories and stuff. And then the whites had a little bit more control in the more rural side of Finland. It's important to understand that there was bad stuff happening already before this. So the National Guards not only got very politicized, so it didn't just mean that if you were in a white guard area and you supported, let's say, the SDP, it wasn't just the fact that you weren't allowed to join that National Guard. but you could be the subject of, just horrible either harassment, random acts of violence, or even just straight up murder. So there was terror on both sides right from the get-go. And this was bubbling up in the background. Okay, so it wasn't something that was talked about publicly, but it was but it was there. It was going on. So then the revolution happens in March, the first revolution. Russian soldiers who are loyal to one of the two sides, they decide, well, fuck this, I'm not staying in Finland, I have to go fight for my country. And all of a sudden, there's nobody, ruling stuff. There's nobody patrolling the streets. And the Russians leave a bunch of guns behind as well. So, of course, the National Guards are going to take them. So now everybody has guns and nobody's in charge. So this is a very scary time for Finland. Now, there's somebody who I need to mention at this point. So the last Senate before independence was... there was a national election that year. Here he is. Oskari Tokoi was the guy who tried to rein in things during 1917, but his government was just not very effective. His government was formed 50-50 by members of the SDP and the political right, but the distrust between those two sides actually reflected really badly on how well the government was able to do stuff, and which was to say that they weren't. If you've watched older Leaders Finland videos, I've talked about this before, that especially during those early years of Finnish independence, Finnish governments lasted for a very short amount of time. It was very common that once a year or once every couple of years the government would change. Like some governments only lasted a few months. There was just so much dissent from both sides. So the Reds and the Whites are not really getting along, and again, we're not sure what to do about Russia now. Are we still part of Russia? What finally forces Finland's hand, of course, is the October Revolution, at which point the Russian Empire stops being a thing, and this thing called the USSR, or the Soviet Union, is officially formed. Well, Finland has thus far kind of operated under the idea that, well, we're part of Russia. We might not like it, but we are officially part of this thing called the Russian Empire. But now that's not a thing. So now the government's hand is forced, and the guy who has to eventually ends up making the decision. So Tokoi loses power, his government falls, and the guy who takes over is this guy, Svinhuvud, our first prime minister under the independent Finland, and our eventual third president. Here's his cabinet, and they're actually another important part here. So Svinhuvud, I've made a video about who I thought were the best Finnish presidents, and I have a little bit of a mixed opinion of Svinhuvud. He was a very stark anti-leftist. He hated anybody on the political left, more or less. And for instance, when he formed his government, he did not let the SDP in it, despite the fact that the SDP had majority in the parliament at the time. But the thing that I do respect and Svinhuvud was also a very authoritarian figure, but the thing that I do respect about Svinhuvud is the fact that he was able to put his own political ideals aside if it was for the good of the republic. Because Svinhuvud's government realized very quickly that, you know what, we really need to start becoming our own thing. Finland has to become its own country. And the only person who can grant us our independence is the guys in charge in Russia right now. This guy, Vladimir Lenin. That's the funny part about Lenin, though. He actually had nothing to do with the first revolution, the February Revolution. He actually only swooped in very late during the October Revolution and took a lot of the glory for what was going on there, but he actually didn't do any of the legwork in the first revolution. But yeah, he was in charge by this point, and Svinhuvud absolutely hated the guy, but he knew that this is the guy we have to go to. So in December, he boards a train, goes to Moscow, goes to Lenin, asks, "May we please have our independence?" And much to his surprise and delight, Lenin says yes. He signs the paper, December 6th becomes the first. December 6th, 1917, Finland officially becomes recognized as an independent country. That's why it's our national holiday, the Finnish Independence Day. Huzzah! Good vibes for everyone. Christmas is saved, if you will. And nothing bad happens for most of Christmas or any of the December. Historians have, suspected that Lenin, basically the only reason why he let Finland become independent at that point was because he suspected, and as history would prove, he was absolutely right, that Finland was about to have its own Red Revolution very soonish. That was Lenin's whole thing. Like, Lenin believed that all countries would eventually just have a communist revolution in them. And the reason he probably knew that was also because he had partly facilitated that. Like, literally, during the build-up to these events, there had also been this guy called Joseph Stalin, who had been making the rounds at the SDP meetings in Finland, and he was, rousing the Finnish the Finnish workers to rise up against the establishment and what have you. So one thing that I will have to say, so the Finnish Civil War, like I said, it was a very, very touchy war. It had very long traumatic effects on Finland, and so much so that even after World War II, it was actually kind of controversial to even refer or talk about it, and people were very touchy about like how they wanted to even call the war. Some people called it a class struggle. Some people called it a Red Revolution. The Civil War has kind of now been formalized as the official term for it. But the problem is, like, a lot of those names have a lot of political weight. So there is absolutely no question that what started the war in January, late January of 1918, were the Reds mobilizing. But it's important to understand why they mobilized. And talking about anything on the Red side is a bit difficult, though, because there was no like definitive leader, because we know who were on the White side. It was the government, Svinhufvud's government, the Finnish officers who sided with the Whites. We know their names. There wasn't really like a single leader figure on the Red side, and that kind of also plays into their eventual like defeat in the war as well, I think. But it's important to understand, so there was all this negative, there was already this tension, there was the terror that both sides were going up against, so both sides were doing something bad. But one thing that Svinhufvud's government did, even though getting Finland's independence sorted out was generally like a good thing, and this is probably why through entirety of the December and things, the Reds decided, okay, we'll lay off now because we're now an independent country. But Svinhufvud not letting the SDP into the government was another major factor. It did feel to the Reds, to the political left, that they were not being really, that they were not given a fair chance at political decision making. So they felt that the Svinhufvud's government was like illegitimate, and it needed to be taken down. And also, around this time, apparently there was this general move amongst the Reds that there were still a lot more moderate leaders on the Red sides, in the Red Guards. But during December and January, those moderate leaders were very quickly pushed aside, and more militant leaders stepped in and took over. And in late January, the Reds moved in and took over Helsinki. On the 27th of January is when the mobilization happened. And even though Helsinki was one of the few places that had like a city guard, they were not like ready at all for the Reds to march in with their guns and stuff. Their plan was obviously to remove the Finnish government. The Finnish government, however, realized, okay, things are going badly, so 2 days later, 29th of January, is when they officially moved shop to Vaasa. You can't see my cursor, but I'll highlight it in the actual video there. Because northern Finland was firmly in white control. So the Reds were on the warpath from January to March. And that's kind of the weird part about all of this, is the fact that there actually wasn't there actually wasn't like a whole lot of fighting, or let's put it this way, there is a list of battles from the Finnish Civil War, but if you look at like the casualties and things, there aren't actually that many people who actually died in like the fighting and stuff, because most of it was like sieges. So people were taking over towns and cities, and what tended to happen was that the losing side, they would just retreat, and so nobody really died. Some people obviously died, but not that many. There wasn't like that much furious fighting, and that was partly the doing of the Finnish government as well. The Finnish government, throughout most of the conflict, tried to get the Reds to step down. They tried to resolve the thing diplomatically. And this is something that the Finnish government also has gotten shit for in retrospect from historians, is that their indecision to move against the Reds probably elongated the conflict by several months. The most intense battle, the most destructive battle, which took several weeks from March 16 to April 6, was actually the siege of Tampere. That was the most severe battle of the conflict as it was going on, but that was after the Whites started pushing back. So it's important to understand that the Reds took over very quickly because there was really no resistance, and there was no real resistance in the South because that's where the Reds were the most powerful. That's where all the factories and industry was. So whatever white sympathizers were there were quickly pushed out or killed, and so the victory of the Reds early on was based entirely on speed, and like I said, there wasn't really like a unified leader. Like all the Red Guard units, they operated independently. There's a long list of officers who were in charge of various units. However, this guy, Kullervo Manner, is the guy that they officially appointed as their like political leader. So this is the guy that they wanted to be sort of their political leader, not president, because because Finland hadn't actually decided if it wanted to have a president yet. That wouldn't happen for another 2 years, or sorry, another year before this. But like I said, that's the kind of the hard part about, like, there isn't really like one person that you can put on the Red side to say that was our enemy. And this is another thing which makes it a bit of a messy conflict to talk about, because this was like a real divide. Like, some families were divided along party lines and things. And so this is why this is such a traumatic set of circumstances. So the important part is to understand about the Red successes in the early part of the Civil War is that it was based entirely on speed. They did not have military prowess. And that was going to become evident in March when the Whites finally started to push back. So like I said, there were some Finnish military officers who had worked under the Russian Empire, who had actual military experience, like Mannerheim, but there were a lot of these guys. They had formal military training. They started training the White Guards, and they knew stuff like how to conduct yourself on the battlefield, how to shoot from formation. Once the Finnish government finally realized that they were going to have to fight, that they were going to have to actually push back the Reds, that's when the Reds completely buckled. So that's the thing that I'm trying to say here. Like, the Reds were very disorganized. They had a few, trained officers, but really the Red Guards were operated, somewhat similar to the Red Army in the Soviet Union, that your military prowess actually didn't matter. Your loyalty to the party was a much bigger, and your seniority in the party was much more important. So in other words, they didn't actually, when actual combat happened, the Reds were always very disorganized and didn't know what to do, and the Whites were always much more organized and tended to cut down the enemy much faster. So that's why once the actual fighting got going, once the Whites started pushing back, the Reds were just completely mowed down. This all then culminates in the retaking of Helsinki, the capital, and at this point, World War I is still going on. And Finland has always, even under the Russian rule, they had always had very good relations with the Germans. And they feel that they need a little extra help. So they ask the German Empire for help. And the Germans do send a consignment of men to attack from the sea. One person who was very opposed to this was actually Mannerheim. And Mannerheim is another person that I have slightly mixed feelings on. On one hand, I do think Mannerheim is a very, very... This guy, is one of Finland's most important people. And he did a lot. He did a lot to try to heal the wounds after the Civil War. But he was a pretty petty and vain person sometimes. And one of the things is like the only reason he was opposed to the Germans helping out in taking it back Helsinki was because he wanted to do it by himself. He wanted the glory for himself. So you have to imagine like how scary it must have been to the Reds when all of a sudden you're losing on every front. The Whites are hitting you up from the north, and then from the sea, all of a sudden there's Germans showing up. So Helsinki getting like taken over. Like that's the thing. Like I said, like the whole thing got folded in about 2 months after the Whites got serious about fighting back. So this is the reason why historians kind of holds Finnhuvud's government a bit accountable for that they drag their feet about, doing the counterattack. On the 25th of April, the camel's back is broken and all the Reds start fleeing to the Soviet border. And finally, on the 2nd of May, the Finnish Senate returns to Helsinki, re-establishing themselves in control. And the official end date for the war, when they officially stop all fighting, is on May 15th. What happens during those last couple of weeks of the war is a very hectic, thousands of Finns, Red supporters, trying to flee to the Soviet border. And the reason they're fleeing is because they're afraid of the retaliation that is going to come for all the Red terror that they have been doing up to this point. So at this point, the war is over, but the after effects will be felt for years to come. And here's the thing: now the Finnish government has these prisoner of war camps with thousands of people in them, and they're frankly at a bit of a loss what to do. And this is where we come to the really gross part of the conflict. So first of all, the Finnish government does get to task to try to figure out like how do we stop this from ever happening again. And this is where Mannerheim actually steps in and does a couple of things. Well, first of all, there's a lot of kids on the Red side who have just been orphaned. A few from the Whites side as well, but mostly from the Reds. Mannerheim decides that he's going to start up 2 organizations that to try to do his part to prevent the further suffering. First is creating, first of all, a formal military for Finland, the Finnish Defense Forces. It becomes an organization based entirely on conscription, meaning that all men, able-bodied men between ages of 18 and 28, regardless of social background, have to be there, have to do military service. And the idea is that because they have to work together, this will hopefully get rid of that class divide and force people to collaborate and work together, because Mannerheim was disgusted by the political divide between the Whites and the Reds. And, even though he fought on the side of the Whites, he was not happy about that particular aspect. And then for the war orphans, he formulates something called the Mannerheim Society of Child Welfare, which is an organization that also still exists today. These days, they're the ones that make those maternity packets that the government sends to all new parents that have like stuff for the baby. But originally, it was formed to help the war orphans. Its entire purpose was to take care of them because there were a lot of people whose parents had been killed in the fighting and stuff. And as well-intentioned as Mannerheim was in creating the Finnish Defense Forces, and it still operates on that same principle. It is still a conscription military service. Unfortunately, what Mannerheim couldn't foresee, or maybe was a little bit blind to, was the fact that a lot of people from the White Guards ended up becoming officers in the Finnish Defense Forces. So during the 20s and 30s, there was a disconcertingly high amount of extreme right members in the Finnish Defense Forces. And that all came ahead in the 30s with the Lapua movement. And this is something, again, that I will say Svinhuvud, luckily, was the guy who cut the wings off that later. In the meantime, however, Svinhuvud is not doing a good job as prime minister. So we have these thousands of people in the Finnish POW camps, and you would think that, okay, these guys fought on the Red side. it would have been very easy for the Finnish government to just go, well, they're all traitors, let's execute them. But we don't do that. That's not how we do things in Finland. Like we still have courts and judges. So these guys are getting charged for crimes. That means there has to be a trial, and they have to go through the trial and then can convict it, and then potentially you can execute them. And you can probably guess that kind of process, it takes time. It was slow. It was very, very slow. It was so slow that more people died in the POW camps than they did from actual executions. And the Finnish government were just not able to come up with a solution for that. And the other part is this, that they also did not stop the National Guards from operating. The White Guards continued to operate in Finland for quite a long time, even after the Finnish defense forces were created. So that was another kind of a blemish on their record. So a whole year passes. So Svinhufvud actually is already voted out of power or steps down in May of 1918, and then we have Paasikivi coming into power. He loses power in the November of that year, and during that time they are not able to, come up with a solution. So basically they're basically a couple of more governments later, we had come to Carlo Castren's government, and they were the ones who finally decide that Finland should become a democratic republic with a president. And they elect this man, Carlo Juho Stolberg, to become Finland's first president. I've talked about Stolberg, how he didn't really particularly like being president and stuff like that. But he finally does something that is, that he feels needs to happen. So during that year, when the government has been fighting over what to do about the POWs, what to do about the Finnish governmental thing, because Finland was originally going to become like monarchy, but then of course World War II ends, Germany's on the losing side, we had appointed somebody from Germany to become our king, and then when Germany was losing, now that we decided, well, okay, maybe not. So we finally decide, okay, we'll have a democratically elected president, he's going to rule stuff, and Stolberg finally gets appointed there. Now, Stolberg decides, his first act as president is that he's going to pardon all the Finnish remaining prisoners of war. And this was a very unpopular decision. There were a lot of people who were not happy at Stolberg's decision. But Stolberg's idea was that there was already like so much suffering, and because so many people had been dying from the POW camps, and he knew that when people were trying to come back into like civil life, their history and background being in the Red Guards was probably going to make life difficult for them anyway. So he decided, like, let's tear the Band-Aid off and, let's try to get things back to normal. Again, these were all, noble ideas. And it's unfortunate, though, that because the Finnish government didn't do anything about the White Guards and didn't step up to, stop political violence, which is why during the 1920s and 30s, we had a lot of political violence, and specifically from the right. There were, people who supported the leftists were, subject not just to like occasional public ridicule, but like just beatings in the street. Members of the Lapua movement, what they did was that they would like kidnap members of like red sympathizers and like take them on these forced train rides to the eastern border, and sometimes they would try to force them to go over the border, which was not a good thing because you can get shot for doing that illegally. So so it was a real fucking shithole. And then it kind of all culminates in the 1930s with the Lapua movement and the Mäntsälä uprising, which I've talked about in my, Who Was the Best President video. That's when Svinhufvud luckily then stepped up and said, like, we gotta stop this shit and, cut it out, is basically what he said. He decided to be the adult in the room and tell the Lapua movement to, where they can shove it. But yeah, that's why it was such a traumatic event, and that's why until the Soviet Union then tried to invade us during the Second World War, that's when really this political tension finally began to dissipate a little bit, because everybody was now unified against the same enemy. And but yeah, like I said, it was still even after the war, it was still a very touchy subject. And yeah, so that was the Finnish Civil War. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, even though this was very rambly and very, very incoherent, I feel, and I could have done a better job with it. But I really wanted to do this, get this monkey off my back, because, I don't want to make promises now about what the next Leaders of Finland video thing is going to be. I hope it won't be another one of these podcasts, but if it is, then, not much I can do about it, but, I've been Hannu TheHande Mäkinen. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.